Friends, up next on Lucy Smiles Living Room podcast, I had an opportunity to sit with Kirsten Frey. Kirsten has an opportunity to share with our community today around grief and what that looks like. She is an advanced grief recovery method specialist. And not only does she talk about practical tips and tools for that she works with her clients, but she actually is able to share some personal experiences in her own life where she was then able to use the tools that she's learned through these programs that she works with to help her clients, but also to help herself as well. We go through some examples of grief. We also go through some of the misconceptions around grief, which I'm really now clear on, and also had an opportunity to look back in my own life in places where I did go through some grieving. And I also know that being here, we are also going to have some experiences in our future where we are going to be faced with grief. And I believe that the tools that Kirsten uses and offers to her clients through her program are significant for us to up-level our relationship to ourselves, up-level our relationship to what grieving is in our life, and just an opportunity for us to get clarity on what that is and how we can move forward in a healthier way. So I hope you enjoy our conversation with Kirsten Frey. Hey friends, and welcome to Lucy Smiles Living Room podcast. I am your host, Diane Lozo, also known as Lucy Smiles. And I'm really excited today for my guest to be here. Kirsten Frey is a really great friend of mine, and she is someone who has been on my heart to want to share her unique gifts when I did launch the Lucy Smiles Living Room podcast for so many reasons. And I'm really excited to have a real and raw conversation around the topic of grief today. So, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I'm excited. I remember when this was an idea that you had. So I'm delighted that you've brought it into fruition, and I'm excited that I get to be a part of it.
Amazing. So before we get started, I want to share a little bit about Kirsten. Kirsten is a transformational life and grief coach. She actually is the only evidence-based use of grief support in the world. So the tools that she uses in her coaching are unique. And I'm really excited to dive into those specifically simply because of the misunderstandings that many of us have around grief, myself included. And that was really a catalyst for me wanting Kirsten to come on to share this. Now, Kirsten also, she actually had a previous career in law enforcement for 17 years. That's a long time. And also has completed her natural nutrition course with the Canadian School of Natural Nutrition with an award of excellence, and also an 8-year professional training career in training with Good Life Fitness. She also has completed her Reiki level 1 and 2. She also has a master's level with her coaching certification through the Canadian Coaches Federation. And in that, currently, she is an advanced grief recovery method specialist, which I'm really excited to share. So Kirsten's passion is to really create education around how people can move effectively through their unique gifts, also to understand what loss is and how she can support her clients and her community around not only what grief is, but educating on the depths of what that can look like for everyone. And I know for myself included, if I look at even the last 4 to 5 years of my life through the loss of my parents, but also moving to a different country, both have levels of grief that I was actually not privy to until I moved through them on my own. And so I'm really excited, Kirsten, not just for my community today, but I'm also excited to learn around what that looks like. And I know that your heart is about wholeheartedly believing that we are here to emotionally be free and to express ourselves in a way that's going to allow that freedom to shine through for all of us. So Kirsten, welcome to the Lucy Smiles Living Room podcast.
I'm happy to be here.
Yay. And so Kirsten, I want to start with, actually, you know what? I didn't really have a plan, but I want to start with this. First of all, when I think about your career professionally, I look at all of the different facets of what you have moved through in your life. Being in the law enforcement industry for 17 years, that's almost 2 decades of your life. And then you actually moved through other facets of your being through that. And a lot of times people could think, as we are adults, I won't say like generally, but many times we could think, okay, we have to find that one career path. What are we going to do when we grow up? Not what are the things that we are going to do through our adult life. So can you share with us what that looked like for you? How did you start your path in law enforcement? And then as you were in that for so long, how did you decide to now move through into different facets of your career?
That's such a interesting question to start with. It's been a while since I've gone that far back. So yes, I became a police officer at the tender age of 21.
Wow.
And I loved it because for me, it was either going to be teaching or policing. And so policing was very good to me. I worked with incredible people, wonderful people. And yet, as you would imagine, there's many things that you see within law enforcement calls that you're going to. We see people at their very worst of how they treat each other. And you also see people responding in the best of ways as well. Throughout that career, there were times where I did lose friends and colleagues to both violence and suicide on the job. So, you experience that your own level of grief, especially when it's people that you know, and also just some of the calls that you're responding to as well, which can be traumatic at times, and just learning how to navigate through that piece of it, which they do better now than maybe when I initially started. There's a lot of peer support available, obviously, a lot of counseling and therapy available for officers, which is wonderful. And it's an important aspect that if it's available to take it. But what we never really talked about was the grief aspect of what had occurred, really.
Mhm.
So, and even at that time frame, it wasn't something that landed for me because I didn't find grief recovery until quite recently. So, a lifetime of accumulating significant losses like we all do throughout our lifetime. From a personal point of view, I have experienced divorce and separation, miscarriage, empty nesting, job changes, a lot of the changes that we naturally go through as we move through this life of ours.
Yeah. So what in your career with law enforcement then, what did that look like for you in terms of moving out of that and into the other facets of your being? And when I look at your career as a holistic, maybe like pie, all of the different aspects of everything that you have offered and learned and grown through, they all tie into each other. So
Mhm.
when I think about law enforcement, I think about like physical fitness, and I look at Reiki which is energy and working with healing from an energetic perspective, and also like the physical fitness. All of those things really tie into each other. They all support each other. So can you walk us through then, for many people that may be in a career for almost 2 decades, how did you decide, like, what did that look like for you, that you said, I'm brave enough to move through a calling that something else is waiting for me to shine my light in a different facet? What did that look like for you?
It was interesting because it happened over a period of time. Like I had always found the more positive areas of policing to be into, and that kind of dovetailed with some personal experiences that I was going through. So again, I was divorced at one point, and I was a single mom for 6 years before I remarried. And so doing that and working shift work and running a house and doing all of those things. Again, I was very fortunate. I loved the work that I did and the people that I worked with. I was very lucky with the people that I worked with. For me, it has been the same thing every time I've gone through a major career change, is that there's this sense of restlessness. It's the only way I can explain it. And it's not coming from the head. It's just this sense of like, it's time to move. And the crazy part is like, I didn't always have a plan as to where I was moving to. So while a lot of people would be like, why are you leaving a job that's got like benefits and a pension and all of those things? And I don't know that I could still explain that. When I did leave, I was remarried and I had the support of my husband constantly, which I was so grateful for. And Yeah, it's just interesting. So I was in a space where I was able to shift out of my career as a police officer. And I had some downtime where I got to be a stay at home mom for a really short period of time, where I got to do the things I didn't get to do when my son was younger. So, like going on school trips and being part of that community. And that happened for a very short period of time. And then sometimes, as these things go, because being fit was part of managing the shift work and my stress response to being a police officer, I was at the gym and was approached by the manager, who asked me if I would ever be interested in being a personal trainer. And I had already gotten the personal training certification when I was a police officer,
Right.
ironically.
Wow.
And so I was already certified in that, and just did some extra training with the Good Life people, and ended up doing an 8-year career there, which was heart fulfilling and joyful. And I think what policing gave me was the ability to sit with difficult situations with people and not shy away from those things. I feel like that's a bit of a superpower for me, where I
Mhm.
can sit with people in the dark, sometimes scary places, and not feel the need to run, where some people might be very uncomfortable and not know what to say. When I shifted into personal training, it was wonderful because it was really positive in helping people, not just with their health and fitness, but I really got to know my clients really in depth. In policing, especially as a frontline officer, you attend a call, you're there for a very short period of time, you're there to sort of handle whatever the situation is at the time. And so you don't always get the follow up with what happens with people afterwards. Working with people in the gym was great because I could actually foster
Mhm.
relationships with my clients. And I was lucky in that I had lengthy relationships with many of my clients. I had very little turnover. I was one of the highest retention trainers out of the entire company for the period of 5 years out of the
Mhm.
8 that I was there. And so it was interesting because I really got to know people on a much deeper level, which is more my speed
Yeah.
of doing things. And I enjoy that. So I was lucky and really enjoyed my career in fitness and health and wellness.
And so where did that lead into now what you're doing with grief recovery? I have a couple of questions around just the irony or the synchronicity around, like, where you were in the police force and then grief recovery, because it's like it all ties into each other. So, but what happened for you that you then had that inkling again, that not the head but the heart, kind of, it's time to make a change? What did that look like for you if you're at the height of your, fitness training, to move into grief recovery? Or did you do that from that? Is that how that transition happened?
So again, I after 8 years being a trainer, it for me again the restlessness
Mhm.
approach. So this is what I mean. Even though it's different, the feeling was the same. So it's just this sense of like it's time to move. It's time to do something different. My days were starting to feel kind of like Groundhog Day, where
Yes.
there was the sameness to it all the time. And again, people look at you like you're crazy sometimes when you're making a shift, because how do you leave a job that's like secure and everything else? And I was fortunate that I was able to make that leap. Um, and I became a coach because what I recognized, and what, my husband would say this to me too. He says, "You're not just a trainer, like you're coaching people." He
Mhm.
says, "I see you at the gym and the way that people are drawn to you and people share with you." And a lot of times people would say, "I've never told anybody that before." And it was just this ability to build trust and rapport with people very quickly. And also that trust, stays in a vault, which is the way it is for me.
Right.
And I took the leap and got my coaching certification, and kind of went out on my own and did coaching. And I was coaching for probably a year and a half before I came across grief recovery. And that was definitely, I know people use the word transformative and it seems somewhat cliche, but for me, it truly was a transformative experience.
Can you share what that means for you with it being transformative?
Sure. So I found out at the age of 48 that I was adopted, and
Oh,
this had
wow.
been yeah, this had been a lifelong family secret. obviously. But at this point, both my parents had died. So there was no one to really get any information from. And so for me, it was a shocking experience. It was obviously upsetting. It made sense in some ways with some things from my childhood, which was fine. There was no trauma or anything of that nature at all. But my parents were both emotionally detached people. And so there was not a lot of, affection or shown affection in our household. It was quite strict and firm. And so, I think maybe I just didn't receive the love, care, and attention that maybe in the way that I needed it. My parents did, a wonderful job in terms of raising us, but there were some things that were missing through there. And there were a lot of things that didn't make sense kind of throughout my lifetime that I never could understand. And learning this information intellectually made sense in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
But I call it like a soul shaking moment. And for me, because I didn't have words for it, and now what I realized was that was actually heartbreaking for
Wow.
me in that moment. Because the way it came across for me, or the way that I felt, was that my whole life had been a lie, that the people that I loved and trusted the most had lied to me about who I was and where I came from, that um, what was wrong with me, that they weren't able to breach that gap in terms of emotionally being connected. And for me, it was just this sense of resentment because we had such a small family, that this secret had kind of kept us apart. And that's the problem with secrets, is that, inevitably it will always come out. And there were other members of the family that were really lobbying my parents to tell both my brother and I the truth of the adoption. And my mom, for whatever reason, just would not hear of it, and actually had told the other members of the family, if you keep bringing this up, you will not have a relationship with these children. And so everybody kept the secret in order to maintain a relationship with us. So we just never knew, and didn't know until after my parents died. And my personal opinion was that I didn't feel the need to go looking for my biological family. I sat with that decision for quite some time.
Yeah.
And I was satisfied with the life that I had created for myself. And, so I had an emotional reaction to the news. I sat with it for quite a while, worked through my feelings, and then just kind of carried on like we do. And thought I was through it, or over it, I guess. And 18 months later, I found out I wasn't quite so over it as much as I thought I was.
Now, when you say that you weren't over it as much as you thought, is that because you were able to learn and get clarity around what grief is? Or can you share? Because I know that one of the things you and I chatted about is the misunderstandings of grief. And so does that tie into how you were able to maybe look deeper into what it is that you were feeling, emotionally connecting to yourself? Or
Sure. And because I had emotional feelings about it and sat with them for a while and shared, with my husband and a close friend, I kept the information very close knit for a while. My brother, I had to tell my brother, and it was interesting because he had the total opposite reaction. So it's so interesting how we can move through a similar experience and yet totally have a different experience of how we go through it. The
yeah.
thing is, for me, is intellectually I come to understand it, right? So we're meaning making machines as human beings, so we always want to know the why.
Mhm.
And sometimes you don't always get to know the why. Like, I'll never know why my mom chose not to tell us that. She had her reasons for whatever they were. And so I intellectually adapted to the situation and the information that I had, but I hadn't actually like healed my heart. So
Okay.
logically, I'd gone through it. And what happened is, over the next 18 months, because I was unresolved with the emotions around this piece of it, the resentment, the anger around it, the feeling of betrayal, etc., was that I started having physical symptoms.
Mhm.
So I had experienced insomnia as a police officer working shift work before, so that didn't feel unusual. But what did feel unusual was anxiety, which I was starting to feel for the first time ever in my life. And I never felt that even as a police officer. And then as that anxiety would sort of progress, um, I found that I was starting to have like heart palpitations, which was odd. And
Mhm.
to a point, and I was in training at that time. So, I mean, I was very well aware of my body. I went and got checked, through the doctor. There was absolutely physically nothing wrong with me. And it just continued on for such a period of time that I would unconsciously catch myself like sort of tapping my chest or rubbing my chest, almost in like an unconscious soothing kind of
Mhm.
way. And
Mhm.
I was fortunate enough at a networking event to meet a woman who is a grief recovery method specialist, and ended up having a conversation with her about what I was feeling. And we had a call, and I ended up starting this work with her. So I was a client initially. And it was very soon within starting this program with her where like the penny dropped for me. And I was like, everybody should know about this because we all move through grief and loss and significant change and transition in our life multiple times throughout our life. And yet we've never been taught what to do. Like we learn how to acquire things in life, but
Mhm.
nobody ever tells us what to do when we lose those important people, places, or things in our lives.
Right, and I'm thinking too when it comes to coping mechanisms, right? We especially if we're confused or we don't really know what we're going through, if we're not emotionally connected to what is transpiring within our nervous system, right, which is maybe where the palpitations and the anxiety when you're not calming your nervous system or emotionally regulating your nervous system, which is everything, then we can find ourselves maybe coping with certain things, which are sugar, alcohol, drugs, any other, insert addictive, you know,
Hmm.
a habit here. So does that would that maybe be a reason why a lot of us can go through trying to cope in a different way because we just don't understand what we're going through. It's very innocent, kind of like naive, experience for us because we're just trying to understand ourselves. And so would that be a reason why a lot of us could have like find ourselves with an addiction or with some sort of like OCD or different things to cope in ways just because we're trying to move through something that we're not familiar with?
For sure, and so that's a big question. The big thing I find with the thing is around grief is that there's still such a misunderstanding around this entire topic because
Right.
I think the majority of people will still attribute grief to the acute sadness that we feel when a loved one dies, which of course it is, right?
Mhm.
Maybe even divorce. But grief is all the conflicting emotions that we feel when there's a significant like change, transition, or loss in our life. So it doesn't have to only be around death. And there's like 40 different life experiences that we have that can create these feelings of grief. So when you don't know that and you think, oh, I'm just grieving when I lose somebody, that they've died, or my pets died, when something or someone has died, then that's when I grieve.
Yeah.
But grief isn't just sadness. It's all these, like I said, conflicting emotions, which can include things like anger, resentment, regret, grief, shame, guilt, all of those feelings. And those tend to be the heavier feelings, the ones that sit with us, and unless you have a way to process those emotions or are even conscious to the fact that you have those emotions and that you are actually grieving, we just kind of go on, right, with this thing. And then this is where we get into these short-term energy relieving behaviors that you talk about, where when there's discomfort or pain, we are looking for a way to resolve that. And
Mhm.
so if you're not conscious to the fact that you're moving through a grieving experience because maybe you've lost your job, or maybe your kid's heading off to college or university. And so, it can be a wide variety of things. Um, but when we have pain, we are looking to soothe. So similar to how I was like rubbing my chest kind of unconsciously or tapping on it, was just this unconscious behavior I was doing to help soothe something that I was unconscious to what it actually was. And so,
Wow.
like you said, pick your poison. There's a wide variety of behaviors that we do include like social media scrolling, gaming for, hours and hours and hours, online shopping, you name it. Like there's a lot of different ways
Right.
that we try to numb out from
Mhm.
the discomfort that we feel.
And I think it's also interesting too that we always, well, I'll not generalize. Many times we think about the specific ones like, alcohol, smoking, shopping, all those. There's so many other ways that we are, like you said, I think you used emotionally release, or what was that you used instead of coping?
Relieve. Yeah, to
Relief. Yeah.
relieve the
It's
discomfort that we feel.
yeah. And then now we do have the social scrolling. So it's fascinating to me. So can you share, and again, this is the grief recovery, method that is globally, unique. It obviously works. Can you share or touch on, say my old perceived, what I thought grief was in regards to the stages of grief? Because for me, I've lost both of my parents over the last 4 years. I've moved countries. There's other things for me specifically, and for the audience listening, so many things that we go through that maybe we don't even know that there's a grief attached to it. So can you share to give the audience in my community, in our community, some clarity that can help them to maybe identify better what grief is? And maybe if you can touch on the misconception of the stages of grief, or in any way that can bring some clarity, because I'm fascinated by this topic.
Yeah, for sure. And there's many ways to move through grief. I think most people, because I still get called like a grief counselor, which I always make sure that people understand I am not a therapist or a counselor. Um, Although therapy and counseling are wonderful, and I say, however, whatever healing tools you need on your journey, like take advantage of them.
Yeah.
And again, like I've been in policing all those years and had been aware of many resources and tools and things like that. I had never heard of the grief recovery method. I didn't hear about it until I needed it. And
Wow.
the grief recovery method has been around for more than 40 years.
Okay.
I've been certified through the Grief Recovery Institute, and the person, John James, who created the program, was a Vietnam vet. So he had done time in the military, had come out of the military, had a young family, and his infant son died shortly after birth. And in his grief and trying to cope with all the feelings that he was having around it, recognized that there was not a lot out there. And in fact, the only thing out there was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's pivotal work on death and dying, where she coined the 5 stages of grief. And
Mhm.
so there's a misunderstanding around that, because her original work wasn't actually meant to be for everyone. It was specifically her research and work with people who had received a terminal illness diagnosis, that were close to dying and were trying to deal with their own emotions around that piece. And so she had, talked about these 5 stages. And what we know now is that there are no stages. And that got confusing for some people, because in the absence of any other way, because therapy and counseling weren't as prominent as they are now, and people just didn't talk about these things. You just kind of pulled yourself up by your bootstraps and got on with it. But that left a lot of people emotionally incomplete with some of these normal and natural feelings that we have when we go through these significant changes and losses that we have in our life. So, well, and it's funny because you still see it in movies and entertainment a lot, where they do still talk about these 5 stages of grief. And we know now that grief ebbs and flows, and sometimes it
Mhm.
feels like a tsunami crashing over you, and other times it might just be a ripple that visits you. But if you're not aware of what it is, like if you're not naming it, how do you tame it?
Oh,
And so
right.
that's why it's really important, I think, that we just sit with, and we all have our own unique ways of moving through and coping with these losses that we experience in life, which we're going to do many times.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes you may not have a big emotional reaction, or your relationship to that person or that thing, like the job or whatever, is one where you can manage quite well. Like there have been losses I've had in my life that just naturally I was able to resolve on my own.
Mhm.
But when I went through the grief recovery method myself as a client, there were several unresolved losses that I had had in my life that were still having an impact at different times in my life for different reasons. And
Wow.
so, yeah, so that was interesting to discover that.
It's interesting that you say that, because I'm I'll share a personal story around, say, the death of my parents, the passing of my mom and my dad. So it's interesting because my dad had been like sick for a long time in my life. And I remember him going through illnesses and just not being well. And a couple of years before he actually ended up passing away, or a year before he ended up passing away, after like 10 years before he had passed away, was really ill. And when he passed away, I feel like I didn't grieve. I was like, why am I not more sad? But when I look back on it, and again, I'm super curious to go through your program actually, and I can think of so many people who deserve the gift of going through understanding it, because obviously it's transferable anytime through our whole life that we're blessed to be here. We could use the tools to optimize our life. And what I think about, so going back to like my mom and dad, I almost would like judge myself and say, why am I not more sad that they've passed away? Like, shouldn't I be more sad? But then I look back and I say, I think I grieved before already. So would that make sense, that I think I actually went through grieving, that when they did pass away, it was just I'm just so curious about what that looks like, because I truly felt like I should be more sad in that acute loss of my mom and dad. But when I look back, the sadness and the things that I went through before were more significant than when they actually left this earth plane.
Mhm. That makes perfect sense. And what I always say, because grief is always around, especially if it's unresolved grief, which I'll be honest, the majority of the clients that I see are not actually in an acute loss. It's actually people that are dealing with unresolved grief that might be from like months ago, years ago. And
Yeah.
it's interesting how it impacts us still. What I say, unresolved grief is always about the things we wish we could have said or done differently, better, or more. It's also about all the unmet hopes, dreams, and expectations that we had for the relationship, because grief is always about the relationship, whether
Mhm.
it's a relationship to the person, relationship to the experience, like a job or a place that's really important to you, like your home. So sometimes moving can really kind of create these feelings of grief that we weren't maybe expecting to have happen.
Yeah.
And so, what I would say is that if you had had the opportunity with your parents, and I know you've done so much of your own personal development work, so you would have a lot of tools to be able to use with that. But if you said everything you had to say to your parents, like there was nothing left unsaid from your heart to share with them, and they had an opportunity to share with you, you had likely moved through that grief
Mhm.
as that process was happening. And so at the end, it might not have been um, as significant because you
Right.
grieved the loss as they were moving through their disease process. And you were resolving everything that you needed to resolve with your parents
Mhm.
while they were still here.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. That's beautiful.
Hmm.
Question for you around your clients, and also maybe even for yourself. Did you find, when you were so blessed, the serendipity of meeting this woman at a networking event? There is no mistake in life, you're right? Everything is on purpose, how you met this person, and then now you are, mastering this to support other people. Is there anything, or are there some things you could share where you were shocked, where you thought, I did not know that this is grief, that you just had those, because I know you had said like the penny dropped, or, kind of those aha moments. And also, can you maybe share as well, are there, like, when you're working with clients where they're just like, wow, I had no idea? Because I'm sure that this grief recovery method really helps to have people open their eyes. So can you share for the audience that, some of those things where it was enlightening, I guess you could say, around what this actually is?
Yes, and this is why I love the program so much, because half of it is about education.
Mm.
So we go through, like, what have we learned about grief in our life? How have you resolved loss experiences in your life up to this point? Was it effective? Was it helpful for you? And then the last part of the program, the last several sessions, there's actually action steps to take. So it's not just about expressing the emotions around some of these maybe unresolved losses that you've had, which is wonderful because some people have never had an opportunity to express in safety
Mhm.
what is true for them, emotionally speaking. And also to have tools that you can take these action steps to move you forward. Because what we find, especially sometimes in support groups, which are lovely, But unless you've got somebody leading that support group that isn't just about like lifting the lid so people can express and share, which is relieving and feels, there's a relieving aspect to that, being able to share, especially if you're sharing similar losses, although this program, you don't need to have that.
Yeah.
And what happens with that sometimes is that it lifts the lid, you get to say it, you feel temporary relief, but you're not actually dealing with what's still unresolved for you. There needs to be an action step in there. And one of the, the misunderstandings or myths that we have around grief is that time heals. And
Mhm.
so it's a bit confusing because yes, there is an aspect to time healing, just like if you have a physical injury, you break a bone, it needs like 6 to 8 weeks to actually knit back together and heal. But it's the action steps that you take. You went to the doctor, you got an x-ray, you got your arm casted. Once the cast came off, you did physiotherapy. So there's
Mhm.
these action steps that you take within the time that help with your healing so that it can heal better,
Mhm.
as opposed to not taking these action steps. So for me, um, yeah, because what we do, like I mentioned earlier, with grief a lot is that we want to understand the why behind things. So we
Mhm.
try to come to a logical way of understanding the loss that we've experienced, um, which is part of the process. However, using your head to heal your heart is the wrong tool for the job because grief isn't logical, it's emotional.
Wow.
So the analogy I use, it's like trying to paint a room with a toothbrush.
Ugh.
It would take a really long time. It's not gonna do a very good job, and then
Yeah.
you're likely gonna have to go over and do it again.
Right.
And that's what happens when we try to use our head to help us heal through these loss experiences, because it's not just a logical process. We can adapt to the changes that come with loss, but adapting isn't the same thing as healing.
Wow. One thing that it's beautiful what you're saying. I'm so taken aback by what you're saying. Something that came to me as you were sharing this at the beginning of you answering this question that really kind of like perked up my ears. What I'm getting from what you're saying is that the work that you're doing helps to, because again, it supports everything. Community is great when you've got support systems and support groups where you can, find that similar, story, or you can like resonate with people who are going through similar things. But what I'm hearing from you is that the work through the grief recovery, like, um, what this is that you're doing with this program allows us to have a healthy progression, because I know, like, through the work that I've done learning about myself and still always learning about myself, is that happiness doesn't actually come from achieving outcomes. Happiness comes from progressing. And so what I'm hearing from you is that, and it's actually a very healthy way of looking at it, is that we are able to progress through this. So we're not sitting in it all of the time. We're not just sitting in it, talking about it the same. We're actually progressing through it so we could move through it, which is what we need to do as humans, is move through things, right? And going through that so that we can use the tools that you have available. Because again, and I say this to myself all the time, is that the worst thing that's happened in my life probably hasn't even happened yet, right? I'm still here on this earth, still learning in earth school. And so if I can actually have tools to help me to be prepared, not that I'm looking for negative things to happen, but to be prepared and say, you know what, I got this. I know how I'm able to like help myself through this and support of other people. But it
Mhm.
seems to me like that's what you're saying. Like the word progression really keeps coming for me as you're sharing insight about this. So,
Yeah, because grief, or when we go through a loss, like we lose something that's important to us, whether it's a job or a person or an experience that we're having, a home, a pet, there's a natural contraction when we have a loss.
mhm,
It's normal to have that. Grief is stressful on our system, and so we have to acknowledge that piece of it. And again, I think a lot of us, because of our conditioning or the way society, maybe in the past, I think things are changing now, in terms of, okay, well, you just kind of got to move on with it, right? And I think we're a little more compassionate to ourselves and other people around that piece of it now, because we know that that doesn't work, because then we end up with those behaviors, right, to
yeah,
numb out from the pain that we're feeling,
yeah,
and we're not actually moving through. So the progression, yes. The thing, what I always tell my clients when we go through the program, is that it's not as if you're never not going to feel sad again about that experience.
yeah.
But it is about emotionally resolving those painful emotions, the anger, the regret, the guilt, the shame, whatever those feelings are, because those are the feelings that anchor us down, and
Mhm.
they're life limiting for our capacity to be able to step forward into life, in happiness or with joy. And grief is just the flip side of love, right? And care
Mhm.
that we had and joy that we have. So if you don't allow yourself to move through the emotions of grief, we do this. And I did this also. So I say this with love. In order to protect ourselves from the pain, because we've experienced the pain and we're like, I don't want to go through that again. So we
Right.
like wall up, right?
Yeah.
We be strong, and we do these things to help us, hopefully mitigate whatever pain may or may not be coming down the pike. But the truth is that we're human, and we have this wide range of human emotions, which we are meant to feel. They are normal and they are natural.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to avoid like this part of grief or loss or regret or anger or whatever it is, those feelings, you're also shutting down being able to really step into like joy and satisfaction and contentment and fulfillment and
Yeah.
creativity and all these other amazing feelings, because you can't selectively numb emotion.
Right.
So if you're cutting off one end of the spectrum, you're also cutting off this other end of the spectrum. And I always remember this. Brene Brown, the author, she talked about when she was doing a book signing, and she does, if you're listeners don't know, she is an incredible woman who's done a lot of work around shame and vulnerability. And I remember her talking. She was doing a book signing, and a gentleman came up and asked her why she didn't talk about men. She goes, "Well, I don't study men in my thing." And he said, "Well, isn't that convenient?" Right? He goes, "Because these women that you're signing all these books for, they they would die if I came off my white horse." So it's this expecting him to be a certain way. And she had this at the same function, another man come up to her who had been married for, I believe it was over 40 years. And he said, I was one of these men who, didn't let myself get too high, didn't let myself get too low, just kind of rode the middle wave, didn't let myself get too excited about anything in any way. He said, and yet, when my wife died in a car accident, he said, it didn't save me from the feeling that I had, the grief that I felt. And he said, I wish now that I had leaned more into those moments of joy.
Oh my goodness. Whew.
Yeah. And
Wow.
and so it's important. That's why like I'm so passionate about sharing this, and this is why I'm so grateful to you, honestly, Diane, for allowing me to come on and talk about this, because a big part of what I do is education. I do a lot of podcasts, I do a lot of public speaking around this, because it is the education piece. Because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, we have all been wounded, in our relationships, and how, relationships with people, whether it's friends, family, spouses, what have you, our children. And if we don't tell our emotional truth, how do we ever really truly heal? And then are we actually authentically living our life?
Living. Exactly. Like, are we actually living our life? And it's amazing too, because there's a couple of things as you're sharing, I'm like getting these. So one of the quotes from Dr. Wayne Dyer, my all-time favorite human being, is when you change the way you look at things, things change. And I was thinking about that because what you're sharing and educating people on is let's change the way that you're looking at grief so that things in your life can then change or shift in a more positive way or healthy way, or now you're building a relationship with yourself. Because as you said, we will have things happen in our relationships with like friends, family, spouses, but also our relationship to ourselves, which is the biggest relationship, right? Because how we are inside is how we show up on the outside. So imagine if we are all given these tools of how to build a healthy relationship with ourselves through the grief that happens in our life, how much happier and healthier and whole that we can be. And also those relationships with other people where we're able to be emotionally connected. Because what I'm feeling from everything you're sharing is that how can we be more emotionally connected to ourselves? And then in our relationships is what a blessing. What a blessing to offer ourselves that opportunity and gift.
Yeah. You
And you
saying
wanna
that's got my head tingling because
I'm like
that's
because
why.
I have to even go further is because you mentioned a couple of things too around, like, the creativity, the passion, because everything in life is contrast. So imagine if we're emotionally connected to ourselves, how we could show up more creatively in our unique gifts. What do we really wanna do with our life? Where are we dimming our light because of, like, unresolved shame, anger, resentment, all of those things? It's almost like what you're doing is the foundation of how can we live our life more freely and optimal, right? And so because I also do believe, like you'd said, it's not like now I'm going through someone, help me go through grief. It's like we all have had grief in our life in so many ways, many of which we didn't even realize. Like, it's interesting, I'll share another personal, just like super short story because I'm having these revelations. Is when I made a decision to move to Mexico a couple of years ago, I was super excited. It was like for us, it was, I believed that it was going to be easy with full of grace, the path of least resistance, which it actually was, and it still is. And I'm so grateful because I believe what you believe is what you create. And there was a one moment after we had come back from a week in Mexico to sign the lease on our beautiful home here. We go back to Canada. And the night that we landed and we were going to bed, I was like, I just went to get ready for bed. And all of a sudden, I started to sob like a baby. And I didn't even understand. I'm like, what is happening to me? And I went through so much in such a short period of time, through the most exciting time of my life. And I didn't really understand it. And what it was is I felt this loss. I felt all these different things. And I'm thinking too, like, if I would have had those tools, because it wasn't like oh my God, I regret it. I still wanted to move here. There was nothing, but I have to be honest though, Kirsten, I was a little bit confused as to what I was actually experiencing. So then guess what I started to do? Judge myself, second guess myself. Happily, I intuitively got back into my heart and I'm like, okay, well, that's just natural, like, grieving, and you're moving away from your beautiful country and it's the first time that making these crazy beautiful decisions. But I do have to say that it doesn't just go away, and if I would have had tools for that, I'm sure that it would have been even, more graceful for me to go through whatever it is. So I just think that this is something that is a unique blessing for people to have an opportunity to learn. It's like foundational teachings, not just grief recovery method, right? So
100%. Because you think about it, they don't teach this in school. Like when, as a police officer, and even like when you were younger and doing, babysitting, we've all done CPR first aid courses.
yep,
Like I've
yep.
done them a zillion times. And yet, have you ever gotten a class on what to do when we experience like change or loss in our lives? And this is why it's not just about talking about death or divorce. It's talking about all these other normal life changes that we go through, which I appreciate you bringing up that example, because there's a lot of things that can be positive changes for us, but it's a loss of our familiar pattern of behavior, right?
Yeah,
Our familiar way of being,
yeah,
right? And so it's you can have like, so if you're getting married, right, which is like, yay, exciting, but now you're not an independent person, you're now part of a partnership, which means now your routines are going to look different. Maybe you don't see your friends the same way as you used to before. You can't just pick up and go. There's someone
yeah,
else you have to take into consideration.
yeah.
A great example of that was when my son went to university several years ago, and he was ready to go, we were ready for him to go, and the whole bit. So we take him to school. Sure enough, I have tears in the car ride home because,
Yeah.
it's a big day and all the rest of it, which I anticipated. But what I didn't anticipate was 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my office. I was working on something, wasn't even thinking about him, but I was thinking about work, and I happened to look up, and my office faced out into our front hallway. And as I looked up, the thought that popped in there was his shoes weren't there. And
Oh,
out of nowhere, similar to you, this like tsunami of like emotion came over me. I had to put my head on my desk for a few minutes and like sobbed it out. And I remember like the observer part of me is like, what is happening? Like what just happened here? I
yeah.
went from not even thinking about him to this like thought about his shoes, and it brought up all this emotion for me. And what
Right.
it was is that I had said goodbye to him to go to school, but I hadn't said goodbye to the relationship I had with him as my little boy. I mean,
Oh,
we still have a relationship, but now that was changing and shifting. He didn't need me to nurture him or, mother him anymore. It was a changing relationship, but I hadn't said goodbye to that little boy,
yeah.
right? And my relationship to him there. And that was an important part of it.
Yeah.
And yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just beautiful. I have kind of like an interesting question for you then. So if someone's hearing this right now, let's say for instance, that story is so clear to me. Are you able to help people move through actually shifting that experience where they don't have to be with the person? Like you're not going to call your son and say, I need to resolve my relationship with you as my young kid. My little boy that was like playing, hopscotch or baseball and whatever in the backyard, or like, so do you help people to go through that without having to be, it's like writing the letter to the person without sending the letter. So is that part of what you're able to help people move through, is to like reestablish a healthier dynamic around situations?
Absolutely. And like the second part to that story was like I didn't recognize that until I started doing grief recovery, which was a couple years later.
Mm,
So what was interesting, because I was unconscious to what was the emotion coming up, I just felt like I was missing him.
mhm.
And his energy in the house, right? Like the house felt different, right? So our familiar pattern of behavior, taking him to basketball practice, dropping him off at work, like all of these things had shifted and changed. And while I had a lot more time available to me and I could work on other things now, it was just the change of our familiar pattern of behavior. But what I didn't, because I was still unconscious to the not saying goodbye, to the relationship part of it, when he would come home for summer, after the first couple of weeks, we would have like butting heads a little bit because, he was coming in kind of treating the house like, we were roommates and I'm like, we're family and you don't have to sit and have a huge conversation with me, but saying hello is kind of nice when you so
Mhm.
there was this like edgy kind of conversation, and part of it was I was still trying to relate to him in the old way, and
Yeah.
it was pushing him further and further away. It wasn't until I did grief recovery myself, and that experience was one of the relationships that I worked on in the program, and that's when I recognized, oh, it's actually, while it's he's moving in the right direction. We were all ready for this change. Like logically, we're all like, this is part of life and this is the next stage, and we were all happy for it. But there was still this sense of like, I'll never drive him to another practice again. I'm never going to like snuggle him up in my arms again, right? Like in the same way that I did when he was little. And
Yeah.
he doesn't need me the same way now that he did when he was younger.
Yeah.
And so it was that awareness that allowed me then to shift how I communicated with him. And like you said, he never knew that like that was one of the relationships that I worked on in grief recovery, but
Yeah.
it's allowed me to change how I communicated with him. And that is what shifted our relationship to a much better place where it is now.
Wow. That is brilliant. And it's interesting because I'm thinking about, you had mentioned like through this conversation that there are like 40 experiences of grief, like 40 different examples or experience or whatever that was that you share. Can you share then, because I'm thinking about that, like the empty nesters, like how brilliant would that be? Because anyone who's a parent is going to go potentially through, now they're no longer, taking care of their children. Now they're in different ways and your relationship is going to shift. I'm thinking about my brother right now. I mean, got so many people I'm thinking, including me first, that needs your work, right? And so can you share for some, that may be a little bit more surprising than other things, like, the death of your dog, the death of your parents, some really traumatic episodes. Are there any that you can highlight that maybe would be valuable for the audience to say, wow, I did not realize like that could be an example of like grief?
Yeah. Surprising. Yeah. Like the empty nesting is one, moving is another one.
Mhm.
Right? Especially if you were very, you had a great neighborhood community, you were very close with your neighbors, like your kids grew up there. So we see a lot of people who are maybe downsizing and going to a smaller home, but their kids were raised there. Like all the memories are there. And
Yeah.
so I've worked with some real estate agents where I share with them, like with your clients, if they're having a hard time around the move, or members of the family are having a hard time with the move, whoever wants to do this, have them go around to each room of the house and everybody share a memory of what like really stood out for me. Like I really loved our backyard because that's where, we had pool parties and barbecues and,
Yeah.
there's a meaning around that pace of it, but it allows everybody to move through the rooms in the house that were meaningful to them and say goodbye in their own way.
Mhm.
The loss of a pet, I mean, obviously that's a death. So for a lot of people, we understand that. But what I think some people don't understand is the depth of the grief that people can feel with the loss of a pet. And I always say, I feel like that happens. This is just my own thought process on this. Often our pets are the only or one of the few examples of unconditional love that we've had in our lives.
Mhm.
And so it impacts us to that degree when
Mm.
we lose them. The key to remember, though, is with every, like even with our pets, you have your own unique relationship with them. And this is what I always say around grief is that, loss is universal. We're all going to go through loss many, many times. But grief is personal. And it's personal because it's about the relationship.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, for example, like, you've lost your parents, my parents are dead as well. And let's just use mothers as an example. Like, if you had a really close and loving relationship with your mom, and I had a difficult and fractious relationship with mine, yeah, we have this similar experience of losing our mothers, but our grieving experiences are going to be very different.
So interesting. Yeah, because you could hear someone say, "Wow, like she took it so much better than her brother did. Like he's having a harder time than her or than him." It's like you're comparing like instead of saying, "Well, of course, everything is unique."
Mhm.
Right? So it's a very that's so interesting because it's the unique relationship.
Yeah,
Wow.
in grief recovery, we always talk about where you don't compare grief and loss because
Mhm.
you can't because we're all unique. And one of the examples that they use in the handbook that we use is, one of the founders of the book was at a dinner party and he was sitting beside a woman who had just moved through or was going through a divorce and he was asking her how she was. But their host had lost her husband to cancer a few months before. And so she said, well, I'm okay, but who am I to complain because, so and so has just lost her husband. And we have to be careful. We have to be careful about doing that ourselves, like to
Mhm.
ourselves, and we have to be careful about doing that to other people because the truth is we don't really know what the relationship is, and we are all going to move through our grief uniquely.
Wow. It's beautiful because it's not a one size fits all.
No,
So you're really working with the human and the soul. That's so
100%.
beautiful. My goodness. This is so enlightening to me. I just think the work that I wanted so badly to have you on so that you could share everything that you did because I think it's so valuable for us. And again, I mean, we've all gone through a lot in the last several years as a global collective and so many things that have been happening. So, Kirsten, in closing, I would love to definitely, I'm excited to share you with anyone that's able to have, listened to this, watching this, gets a chance to, experience this clarity that I've definitely, have gained from your work. Can you share where we can find you? Also, is there anything that you want to share around how to get started or like you're taking clients obviously, so like can they email you? Is your the best place to find you? Where can we find you on social media or website or anything like that?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to share this. So I do have a website. It's www.tlclifecoaching.com. I'm
Mhm.
also on Instagram, which is where I hang out if I'm going to be on social media. There, I'm on Facebook too, but not as active there. But at TLC Life Coaching on Instagram, also on LinkedIn
Okay.
under the same. And what I would suggest is if people would like to have more information, I always do a complimentary discovery call.
Mhm.
And I do that for a couple of reasons. One is to make sure that people understand that, I'm not a therapist or a counselor, and also to hear more about like where they are in their experience, because I know what it takes to move through the program. And the program itself is simple. Like it's a very simple program, but it's not always easy. And
Right.
so I know what it takes to move through this work, and it gives us an opportunity to share and make sure that the person feels comfortable with me. And
Mhm.
also, is this the right time for people, because there is homework involved in the program. So not only do you have to be available for our session times, but also to be able to do the reading and some of the homework that is specifically designed to help people move through their loss experience. And sometimes it's not the right fit. So, and that's fine. And I'm happy to refer people out to someone else or other resources or tools that might be more available to them. And I'm also happy, Di, to offer, I'll do a link to an ebook, a grief ebook that'll cover off some of the things that we've talked here about today. So people can have free access to that, and feel free to share it with whoever they want to share it with. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. It seems like perhaps too, it would be a unique experience for everyone going through it. So you would want to get a better sense of like how you could work with specific people, because their grief could be different in different components. So having that discovery call is really pivotal in terms of, working through specifically with people, what that looks like. So
and I'm careful with this too, because I don't work with people who are in active addiction at the time. And also, while I have my own experience with trauma, I am not a trauma-informed practitioner. Although I always say, that's why I'm always happy to refer out to actual therapists and counselors who have that training and background. The thing to remember is there isn't always trauma in grief, but there's always grief and trauma. So if you're not having the conversation about grief in your trauma therapy, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle.
Wow, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I would love to just ask you a question. I like to ask a question at the end of all of my episodes, and they're always different. So if you were to, shed some light or some guidance to those watching outside of, the potential to be able to work with you, if you were to, offer some heart-centered insight to those who may be questioning if they are going through grieving, or if they're, confused as to what that looked like, to bring hope to those watching today, can you share some light around maybe something that you've experienced that could support them, just in essence of being where they are right now in whatever aspect of grief that they may be experiencing?
Mm-hmm. It's to honor the process and to allow yourself to feel what you're feeling, and to find, if you find that you need some assistance or guidance moving through that, because we're not here to do this life by ourselves and alone, right? Mm-hmm. So I want people to know, first off, you're not alone. That the key to recovery through these loss experiences that we have is to take action. And even if that action is to pick up the phone or send the email asking for more information or guidance, or picking up a book that could help you in terms of moving through your grief experience, because a lot of people are still really uncomfortable talking about grief. Mm-hmm. And so that's the other thing that I love about this program, is that it's not only about us being able to move through our own grieving experiences, but when you do, you learn more about about grief than anybody, probably 90% of the population knows. So it allows you to be a better support for the people in your life as well.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kirsten. You are amazing. And I just want to say thank you again for sharing your beautiful heart, your wisdom, and also just your kindness that radiates through you, the work that you do and who you are as a human, as a soul, as a woman, entrepreneur. And, I love what you shared around just the whole scope of who you are. I really believe that we can change what we do with who we are through the years that we're blessed to be here. And I love how everything just encapsulates the work that you've done and where you are in this moment. So, and to thank you to all of my community who had an opportunity to watch Kirsten today. I hope that something brought clarity to your heart. If you feel prompted to work with Kirsten, we'll have all of her information in the show notes. And my wish and my mission on this earth is to have people follow the magic that ignites their inner essence. And I actually do believe that the opportunity, the potential to work with Kirsten can help to up-level that essence in all of us. So if you feel that something shifted in you, I would love any comments. I would love for you to share this beautiful episode with those that may be a bit confused around what they're going through, that need some more clarity on their own path. And just to definitely follow the magic that ignites your inner essence. And until next time, we will catch you soon. Thank you, Kirsten.
Thanks, Di.
So blessed. Hey friends, thank you again for following and tuning in to the Lucy Smiles Living Room podcast. It really does truly support my mission to help inspire you through our beautiful guests that that I also want to thank who have come on to share their beautiful stories of transformation. If you want to connect with me privately, you can actually go right to my website, lucysmiles.com. Feel free to send me a personal email. You can also catch my newsletter by subscribing, which also includes my weekly intuitive messages. If you're on social media, you can follow me with my handle, I am Lucy Smiles. And if this was inspiring to you and something helped support you on whatever the journey is that you are going through, please feel free to review, write a comment, and most importantly, if you can subscribe and share this episode and all our other episodes, that would be amazing. My dream and my mission is to truly help you to follow the magic that ignites your inner essence. And so until next time, we will catch you soon. I hope to catch you on the next episode.